Hello, YouTube. It's time now for the segment I call Stream Chatterbox, where I've just finished my gaming stream and it's time to talk about something that actually matters. Yes, that's right. It's time to talk about important things. In this case, the important thing is a man who thinks he is just every bit as important as he is. In fact, he thinks he's quite a bit more important than he actually is. But that's only because he thinks he's probably more important than every other man who has ever lived in the history of the world. The reality is he is unfortunately, sadly, quite important still, even though he's only going to be president for another month or two. It seems like he's still doing things, still pushing his agenda forward, still trying to make an impact in the world. And unfortunately, his style of impact in the world is the worst of all possible impacts in the world. His style of impact in the world is the push towards the far right, the push towards what we like to call the fascism. And now, fascism. I'm just going to take a step back. I'm just going to like take a step back from my microphone here for a second because I used a big word and I used the word fascism, which if you had asked me about it like 6 or 7 years ago or something like that, I would have given like some sort of spiel or rant or something about how people overuse the word fascism. In fact, I still think that they overuse the word fascism. There's a lot of people who think that fascism is just kind of like whenever there's something that's kind of authoritarian, whenever like a cop gets in your face, that's a fascist cop, or like whenever there's a right-wing politician who starts wars, like a George Bush type, then that's a fascist politician, or, it gets thrown around an awful lot. But in reality, it means a very specific thing. It means a government that exists along certain lines, that uses certain tactics to achieve a situation where under capitalism like we have today, they're no longer bound by the rule of law or by whatever type of democratic principles we have. Now, in the past, fascism has usually existed as a response to some form of mass movement, some form of revolutionary movement that threatens capitalism, that threatens society and threatens what the rich have and threatens to bring them all down and bring this world crumbling to its knees. And we have not seen that in America. In fact, the left in America and the mass movement in America, as brilliant as the Black Lives Matter movement was, and that was a wonderful movement to watch, and a wonderful movement to take part in, we're far from overthrowing the American government, people. We have to understand that. So fascism has typically been a response to when people are close to overthrowing the government. It's been an emergency release valve. It's been a switch flipped to put down the movement, to imprison all the activists, all the socialists, all the trade unionists, all the threats, and to scapegoat a whole lot of minorities and a whole lot of people with no power in order to justify imprisoning the dangerous ones. That's how fascism works. And it works in some very specific ways. So when I say that Donald Trump is pushing towards fascism, that's an interesting thing to say. It's an ahistorical thing to say. It's something that is unusual for that to exist in a country in the situation that America's in. But I still think it's true. I would have thought it was crazy 10 years ago that I'd be saying this, but now I think it's true. So let's look at what Donald Trump did yesterday. And that's why we're covering it today, because we like covering something that's topical. Yesterday, he had his first rally since losing the election. Now, when the election happened, or a few days after the election, there were all these rumors that Donald Trump was trying to restart his rallies. There were rumors that his goal was to start having mass gatherings and mass rallies again, and he was going to mobilize people, and he was going to overturn the election results, and all that, and radicalize the right, and kind of impose his will over everything. But the people around him, the Republican Party, the powerful people behind him, thought that this was an awful idea. So he didn't do it. He didn't do a rally tour or anything. And one thing I'd like to talk about today is I'd like to talk about not only what Trump represents and not only what Trump is pushing towards, but what the people behind him represent. What the reasons that the people behind him put him in a place where he could potentially win the presidency in the first place. It was very unlikely. He was an outsider. And frankly, you don't win a Republican nomination without insiders helping you out. without some root to the inside. So we'll talk a little bit about why he was given a root and what they had in mind for the country. But first, this is what happened yesterday. Yesterday, he did hold his rally. He held his first rally since losing the election, and he did it on the pretense that he was advocating for the election of the two Republican senators, or the re-election of the Republican senators in the state of Georgia. Now, this is a very important race because there's two seats that are going to have a revote in Georgia. And if the Democrats win both of them, that means the Senate is tied. That means both parties have the same number of Senate seats. And if the Senate is tied, the vice president casts the deciding vote, which would be Kamala Harris. So, in essence, a tie goes to the Democrats in this case. It's very unlikely at this point because Georgia is a red state, and we saw in red states a lot of people came out to vote specifically against Donald Trump. And they also voted for other blue people on the ticket, blue senators and so on. I think it's unlikely that those people come back out to vote only for blue senators when they're not also voting against Donald Trump. But we'll see. It's possible. So it made sense to send Trump down to do some campaigning. And instead of doing campaigning, he talked mostly about election results, continuing his narrative about how the election was stolen and rigged and how he actually won by a mile, and he's talking about let them steal Georgia again and you'll never be able to look yourself in the mirror. It'd be the end of the world if they stole Georgia twice because they clearly stole it once. Now, I don't need to tell you about any of that. You have to be living under a very, very large and very, very dark rock in order to not have heard the Donald Trump narrative about how the election was stolen. We all know that the election was stolen. But what's interesting is the way people are responding to this. Now, here is global news. I'm Canadian, so I like Canadian news sources sometimes, and I find it's often easier to get a real sense of what's going on in a country by looking at how other countries, in particular neighbors and countries with close links, see that country. Now, this is global. Global is the most right-wing of the mainstream Canadian media outlets. It's not Fox News by any stretch. It's a ways more moderate than Fox News. But it was the part of an empire called Can West that was run by a man named Izzy Asper before he died about 10 years ago, I think, something like that. And Izzy Asper was a multi-billionaire. I think he was worth a little over $2 billion when he died. And he created a right-wing media empire, as multi-billionaires tend to often do. So it's interesting that it's global news here that we see doing fact checks. And as we go down here, if I lost, I'd be a gracious loser. Nope. There are a list over and over again. We won Georgia. No, he didn't. Of fact checks here. And what's interesting to me is not that global news would tell the truth about this. They would. They are what we call a liberal democratic media outlet. They are not a fascist media outlet. Liberal democracy or liberalism in general, is a term that is often completely misunderstood, frankly. What we live in today and what we've lived in for the last couple hundred years or so is a liberal democracy. It's hard. And all the parties that represent the status quo in the system we live in are liberal parties philosophically. Our Conservative Party is a liberal party in that they represent liberal democracy. They represent the norms of liberal democracy. They're very pro-corporate, very right-wing. They will scapegoat minorities. They will attack unions. They'll try to damage our healthcare system. They'll do all sorts of nasty stuff. But that's part of what liberalism is. Liberalism is this type of society where we manage an economy that's good for the very, very rich, good for the capitalists. And we do it in a way where we also give people rights And we also have elections that are free, and we don't have, obvious secret police. We don't arrest people for protesting. There's a right to free speech and gathering, or something kind of similar. Canada doesn't spell out the right to free speech quite the same way America does, but it's still in there. So what we have in Canada is that even the most right-wing media outlet is still a liberal media outlet. It's still aiming at the status quo. But America's different. And even before Trump, America has been moving in a different direction for quite some time. Fox News in particular has dragged America in a very different direction. Fox News is run, of course, by its own billionaire media, mogul. Mogul's the word. A media mogul named Rupert Murdoch. But they have gone away from the norms of liberal democratic media outlets, whether they be left-wing or right-wing. And CNN, for instance, frankly, they're very right-wing, but they are a liberal media outlet. So Fox, by being willing to participate in open propaganda, by being willing to discard the necessity of honesty within their coverage, they have created a second form of media. All media is biased. All media is propagandist. All media sucks. Mainstream media, the media that's owned by billionaires. It all sucks. It's all awful. But Fox was starting to straddle the line towards what would be more of a traditional fascist media, especially in shows like Tucker Carlson's show, especially when they have their commentators on and not so much their news anchors. They'll say outright lies on Tucker Carlson. They'll do whatever they can do to try to push their audience to the right as hard as possible. They will not let the norms of liberal democracy get in their way of that. And they have had a massive effect on American culture. This article here is about the Overton window. Now, I know some friends who are lefties, who are socialists like I am, who don't like the idea of an Overton window. They don't agree with it being a thing. But I think that's dumb. I think that's super, super dumb. The Overton window is one of the most important concepts to understand the movement of society in general. There's problems with it. For instance, there is, let's see if I can find it here. I don't know if I can. When Overton was was writing about the Overton window, it was during the Cold War era in Western academia. And the Cold War era, if you were to be a respected academic, you could not frame things in terms of class. You could not frame things in terms of left and right. You would not get funding. You would be pushed out of the universities, or at least pushed out of accepted canon within universities if you framed things that way. So you see, Overton framed his Overton window as being simply between more freedom, less freedom, or authoritarian, libertarian kind of. That was the gap he was thinking about. And this is in line with the predominant Western intellectual theory of the time, the horseshoe theory, the idea that either on the far left or the far right, you get authoritarianism, and it's basically the same. And, if you're in the middle, in between the far left and the far right, then you get freedom, And this is fucking stupid. It falls apart under the least little bit of scrutiny, but it's very much a product of the philosophical bent within universities during the Cold War. So if we get rid of that idea, screw that idea, screw the horseshoe theory idea, we realize that the Overton window makes a great deal of sense. Because different societies do have different barriers on what's considered a rational form of discussion or a rational idea. And when I say rational, I don't mean correct. I just mean reasonable in any sense at all. One example I like to use when I'm talking about the Overton window is healthcare in America, public healthcare. Now, up until Bernie Sanders' campaign, up until about 6 years ago, 5, 6 years ago, it was considered this crazy notion to talk about healthcare, to talk about single payer healthcare. It was like completely off the charts. Like what are you, crazy? I mean, government pays for healthcare? That's insane. Now, never mind the fact that like 90% of the world does it. Even like most of the third world, even like very poor countries tend to have single payer healthcare because it's more efficient. It's not just fairer to the people. It's way more efficient in terms of money spent. It's not even close. Private healthcare is just awful at what it does, like straight up awful. But because public opinion was where it was in America, you couldn't talk about the only rational, the only like realistic choice for delivering quality health care. That was completely off the table. All that it took was a situation where healthcare costs were spiraling out of control, as they have been doing for quite some time, and a politician who was popular and achieved a mass base of support in Bernie Sanders to bring it up, to drive it home, to talk about it over and over again, to normalize it. It became normalized. Now, it's only 5 years later, not much time has passed at all, but every Democratic politician who wants to run for president has to face the question of single payer healthcare over and over again. And of course, because they're corporatists, because they are all for the benefit of private property, and that includes medical companies, Bernie is so far the only realistic candidate who has actually proposed it. Biden is certainly not going to do it. That's not a thing for Biden. Not at all. But it's part of the discussion. It's part of the questions that he has to face. And that's a change. It's a big change. And in fact, when you look at polls about single payer healthcare in the United States now, you find that those polls come out consistently in support of single payer healthcare. It's no longer a dirty word. It is, in fact, what people want, which makes sense because it makes sense. But that's the Overton window. That is the result of the Overton window having expanded to the left in that one particular way in the last 5 years. It's the window of what is acceptable to ask for or what's acceptable to demand. Now, Fox has pulled quite a trick, and it's not just Fox. I shouldn't say that like it's just Fox. It's not. It's a whole lot of media sources run by a bunch of billionaires. It's people on the internet. It's Breitbart, and it's many different YouTube channels, lots and lots of them. They have all normalized what 2 decades ago, say, in American society was not normal at all. And that is a stream of thought that calls for a far right-wing government based upon essentially fascist tactics, fascist principles, fascist actions. This is the change that has made many networks barely even blink when Trump put secret police, when Trump put secret police in the streets of American cities. Now, the old liberal media, the CNNs of the world, as right-wing as they may be, they talked about it. They did not want these prison guards, essentially, and immigration officers being grouped together in these unmarked uniforms to beat the shit out of protesters in cities. But Fox didn't have a problem with it. Fox cheerleaded it. Fox called for cracking skulls all the way through. The suppression of dissent, the suppression of peaceful protest, the suppression of free speech. These are all on the table now. They weren't before, but they are now. The Overton window has been pushed dramatically to the right. And it's been done in a number of phases. Post 9/11, it was pushed to the right in terms of foreign policy. Very, very hard. It was pushed in terms of creating an other, creating a underclass that is less than, starting with Muslims and the countries that we didn't mind bombing the shit out of and killing literally millions of people. Like the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, I think a lot of people don't really understand that, yeah, you know, what about like several tens of thousands of American soldiers died, and that's awful. It's terrible. Soldiers are always pay the brunt of war, you know, like it's we need to bring the troops home to protect the troops, you know. Troops are important. They are working class people who are mostly trying to pay for their education or something similar, and it's awful when they suffer. But we have killed, and when I say we, in the case of Afghanistan, I mean Canada as well. I'm Canadian. In the case of Iraq, I really just mostly mean America, have killed millions of people. Millions. And that's not disputed. The death toll is in the millions. And that's been perfectly okay. Now, the stated goals were things like, you know, fighting back against terrorism, but if we're being real, and this is a different topic entirely, but if we're being real, these terrorist groups were mostly planted by the CIA and other Western intelligence agencies, you know, often by Israel, to fight against both Soviet advancement into the region, especially in Afghanistan, and against revolutionary movements, especially in Iran. So they were our good guys. They were our buddies, and it doesn't take much to look through old media and see old presidents, you know, praising the Islamists when they were fighting the Soviets. Doesn't take much to see that Iran was an ally when it was when the Ayatollah rose up and overturned the revolution of the Tudeh Party, which was a genuinely socialist revolution. It was a left-wing revolution. But they're out of control now, I guess. And because of these wars, they have massively increased their influence. They have massively recruited. They are stronger than they ever have been before because their enemy is now an occupying force. Their enemy is a force that has killed millions upon millions of people, has probably killed at least one person in almost everyone's family in those countries. Everyone knows someone who's died in these wars or who's died as a result of starvation or something else, you know, something that's associated with the wars. Everyone has a reason to want to fight back, to be a freedom fighter, as they would put it, a terrorist, as America would put it. The reality is there isn't that much difference between a freedom fighter and a terrorist, except which side they happen to be on. These concepts are very much interrelated, sad as it is. So that's been normalized. But Trump here, this is Donald Trump's Twitter account. I'm going to talk a bit about what he's saying recently. Let's go here. Oops. Reopen, close tab. We will not bend. We will not break. We will not yield. We will never give in. Let's hear it in his words.
And we will never back down. We will never, ever surrender. Because we are Americans, and our hearts bleed red, white, and blue.
This right here is normalized. This is not normal. That's what I'm saying.
We will not bend, we will not break, we will not...
That type of a rally, those type of points, those are not usual in liberal democracy. That is a particular type of radicalism, a particular type of radical narrative that can allow for the country, the love of the nation, the power of the nation, the glory of the nation, the greatness of the nation, to be placed above puny concepts like freedom of expression or association. And we see here that this has, here's an Atlantic article, that this Trumpism is very, very different, and I agree with them completely, by the way, very different from conservatism, very different from traditional republicanism. It's something very, very new. And it's something that, importantly, is not it's something that is being fought back against within the Republican Party, because the traditional Republican Party is on the right side of liberalism, liberal democracy. That's what conservatives believe in. Conservatives believe in liberalism. That's something that kind of the popularization of these terms is different, but that's very, very true. Liberalism, by the way, is not a good word. It's a nasty word. It's not as nasty as fascism, though. Those are very different things. So we see this fight within the Republican Party, and it's not the first time we've seen a fight within the Republican Party for what they want to stand for. We saw a similar situation come about with the Tea Party movement. You remember the Tea Party movement? That was, 20 years ago, maybe almost 15 to 20 years ago. And the Tea Party movement was an attempt to normalize wars and intense over-the-top patriotism and a farther right-wing narrative that had not previously been within the American Overton window. When the Tea Party started, they were considered this fringe right-wing group within the Republican Party. And then they grew and they grew. And pretty soon, they were the majority of the Republican Party. Pretty soon, their talking points had become Republican Party talking points. Now, when Trump first arrived in the political picture, I strongly believe that people did not think he was going to win the Republican primary. He probably thought so because he's an egomaniac. He'll think anything. He still thinks he might hold on to the presidency somehow. It's not going to happen, but I think he thinks so. But the people behind him, the power brokers that pushed him there, they wanted a new Tea Party. They wanted a Tea Party that would again push the Overton window farther to the right, that would make farther right-wing concepts acceptable within mainstream American discourse where they hadn't been before. They wanted to make a Tucker Carlson type of right-wing America. And somehow, go figure, Trump won. Now, it's important to understand that a lot of Trump's closest associates and his closest advisors have formerly been straight up white nationalists, straight up fascists. And I'm talking about people like Steve Bannon, and I'm talking about people like Stephen Miller. Miller might be the worst, and Miller's written a lot of Trump's biggest speeches. He's a full-on fascist. There's no scapegoat. There's nothing else to call him. He's someone who would never have had a role in the George Bush government. He's something else entirely. And it's people like this that pushed Trump into power. But now that Trump has lost, we're seeing another turn. Throughout Trump's presidency, yes, it was about expanding the Overton window to the right, and he did. He normalized a whole lot of bad shit. But he also replaced a whole lot of government officials. He made a whole lot of changes to the ways that the American government functions. And these are changes that won't be easily undone. And he's still making changes. He's still firing people left, right, and center. He's still replacing those people with others who are farther to the right. He's still shifting what is normal American right-wing behavior. And at this point, the old guard, say Mitt Romney, for instance, Mitt Romney is a conservative. Mitt Romney is not like Donald Trump. He is not in any way a fascist. He's not a proto-fascist. He's not any of these things. He's a conservative. And there's a lot of conservatives in the Republican Party, and they're trying to fight back, but they're losing. And then you have this. Now, it's no secret that Fox News was a huge part of why Donald Trump was elected in the first place. Fox News supported Donald Trump the entire time. But Fox News is playing a game where they still need to be somewhat accepted, somewhat acceptable within the media landscape of liberal democracy. They still need to keep a toe or two in the field of conservatism, in the field of normalcy. Tucker Carlson can go like way out into crazy town if he wants, and they've had like equally crazy people on in the past. They've always had like one or two completely nutso commentators on Fox that try to push things. But their main news programs, their journalistic anchors still have to maintain a degree of respectability, because otherwise Fox might be in some trouble. Fox plays the role today of being the entry point into far-right media. So once Fox becomes normalized, which it is not, I should just repeat this, there are not analogs to Fox in other liberal democracies around the world. It's a particular phenomenon of this age and a particular phenomenon of America. It's very far to the right compared to anywhere else. But at this point, because of the way the Overton window has been pushed, because of the radicalization we've seen, it is now the shallow end of the far right pool. It is now the place that people start going down the road of radicalization. That still seems kind of normal and still seems kind of mainstream, and people can dip their toes in it and not feel too scared, not be pushed away because, oh, crazy ideas. And then they can wade deeper and deeper and deeper. And there are so many new media sources within the last 5 or 10 years that have popped up to be the deeper. And the deeper keeps getting deeper and deeper, and the pool keeps growing. And now we have Donald Trump saying, Fox News daytime, he says here, but he said the same thing about their evening anchors and their weekend anchors, is not watchable. It's in a class with CNN and MSNBC, I guess, except Democratic National Convention. That's very clever, Donald Trump. Good for you. He suggests that instead his followers check out the One America News Network and Newsmax and others who are similar. These are full-on far-right propaganda outlets to the point that it puts Fox News to shame. I think if Fox News, or at least if the Tucker Carlsons of Fox News, could get away with being One American News Network, they absolutely would. But the position they're in and the role they're playing within the building of the far right is that entry point, is that most watched network on television entry point. And now Trump is trying to take people who are at the entry point and push them a step farther. He's trying to radicalize the country even more than it already is. He's trying to build the base for fascism stronger than it already is. Now, this is not actually a quote. It's, what's his name? Yes, Sinclair Lewis. It's something that you often see on the internet being attributed to Sinclair Lewis, the author. But it's a misattribution. It's like many other internet quotes. It was actually someone, I forget his name, in the 70s, who was talking about Sinclair Lewis and sort of paraphrased Lewis's work, paraphrased the contents of his writing to this. And I like this. This is very direct, it's very to the point, and it's very true. When fascism comes to America, it'll be wrapped in the flag and carrying a cross. And that's what we're seeing. That's Donald Trump's base of support. It's wrapped in the flag, it's carrying a cross, and it's beating the shit out of protesters. That's three things it basically is doing, especially if they're protesters of color, of course. Here's a little bit more information about the book It Can't Happen Here that was misattributed, or that this quote supposedly comes out of. It doesn't. But books about this sort of stuff. Now, it's a 458-page book, so instead of like going through the actual book, I thought I'd go to this little handy-dandy Wikipedia plot summary here. So let's read along. This is a fictional story set in 1936 during the rise of fascism in Europe, where it talks about the American fascist leader and the ways in which this American fascist leader would have to be different from the European leaders who were of the same basic ideology. So he talks about how an American fascist would not appear like a European fascist. Fascism does a thing where it takes the mythology of the country, the mythologized like great history and great past of the land, and it blows it up bigger than life, and it makes it into this this ideal that every person must strive for. And if people aren't striving for it, well, they don't belong in the country now, do they? That's how it works. But in America is a very different situation. America was built on capitalism. But America was built on liberal democracy. You know, and that wasn't the case in Italy or in Germany in the 1930s. That was a relatively new thing there. So in America, you talk about outlawing dissent, and believe me, we saw that happen this year. The ways that cops and secret police and the National Guard beat the shit out of civil rights protesters during the Black Lives Matter movement this year, and that's what that was. That was a civil rights movement, no different from other civil rights movements. When they beat the shit out of everyone, that's outlawing dissent. They arrested some. They could have arrested a lot more. And if this continues, they will normalize arresting a lot more people and holding them in jail for long periods of time. And when jails are so full, they're already very full, but when they're so full that you can't have typical prison structures, that's when you get concentration camps instead. And in fact, we're seeing that. They started arresting more illegal immigrants than they had before, and they didn't have enough room in the holding cells that they'd always used for arrested illegal immigrants. So they built concentration camps. And that's where we got kids in cages. So America definitely has concentration camps. And they will, if this continues, if this process continues, they will grow and become an even more serious problem than they already are. He trains and arms a paramilitary force called the Minutemen, named after the revolutionary militias of the same name. And that's really interesting because America today has paramilitary forces named the Minutemen and named other things that go back to the Revolutionary Wars that are right-wing shock troops that haven't fully mobilized yet, that haven't crushed protest often. They've certainly driven over a lot of protesters. They've murdered protesters. They've shot protesters. But in isolated acts, not as a group aggression. Not yet. We're on the edge of it, but not yet. Now, one of his first acts was to eliminate the influence of the United States Congress, to destroy democracy, essentially, to overturn the possibility of Congress getting in the president's way. That hasn't happened. But what we have seen is Trump ruling more and more by decree, sidelining the Nancy Pelosi-run Democratic majority Congress over the last 2 years. And we've seen him try to rig an election. We've seen him try to overturn the results of an election that he did not successfully rig. We're seeing him try these things. It's very, very similar in form to what people have always predicted. And I'm not trying to focus on this one author or this one prediction. There are a lot of authors, there are a lot of predictions about what fascism would be like in America. Even Marxist authors of the past, which Sinclair Lewis is more of a fiction author, you know. He's not like a political writer per se. I mean, he is a political writer, no question about it, but people who've written trying to analyze fascism from the left have also written about America. There's a wonderful piece called "If America Should Go Fascist" that I think is quite good, and they all write about the same thing. Fascism in America does not look like fascism in Europe, but it's nonetheless is fascism. It's based upon a worshipping of business, of the American dream, of how the American dream has been lost and must be reclaimed, and it's draped in the American flag. What Trump is doing now that he's out of power, what the people behind him are doing now that he is out of power, the direction he is pushing now that he is out of power, is to turn the Republican Party from what it is now, which is essentially a Tea Party party, into a mainstream fascist party. He is trying to mobilize support for networks and media outlets that are significantly to the right of Fox News, that can't be called anything other than fascist propaganda outlets. There's no other way to describe them. He's normalizing and trying to establish credence and a basic narrative for how American democracy is dead, how elections are now being stolen by the Democrats, how they're being stolen from the American people, how the very institutions of American democracy are corrupt to the core and must be destroyed. And he's planting seeds suggesting that he's going to be the one to destroy them 4 years from now when he runs again. I don't know if he's going to run again or not, but I know one thing that I'm almost certain of. Whoever wins the next Republican nomination 4 years from now or 3 years from now, whether it's Trump or whether it's somebody else, they're not going to win with conservatism. They're not going to win with right-wing liberal democracy. They're going to win with calls to fascism and authoritarianism. They're going to win on the basis of suppressing dissent. They're going to win on the basis of unbelievable levels of racism, which we haven't seen even in the Trump era, which we haven't seen for half a century. They're going to win on the basis of mass imprisonment of protesters and activists. And they're going to do it all to save America. It won't be about making America great again. That's a slogan for yesterday. The slogan for tomorrow is saving America from the radicals who would destroy it. This is not the impotent flailings of a toddler. He knows what he's doing. I do think he's crazy enough to think he might actually succeed in keeping the presidency, but I know the people around him don't believe that for a second. The people around him, though, do share the goal of bringing America into a fascist, making America into a fascist state. So it is no longer a liberal democratic state, and it is a fascist state. And they want to do it for two reasons. One, because they want power. They want to be the ones in charge. They want to be the ones who direct the guns and who say which people end up in the prison cells and which ones don't. And they're doing it because they understand that America is crumbling. We may not have mass revolutionary movements in America today. We certainly don't have mass revolutionary movements in America today. But people are waking up to the reality that things need to change. America will not come out of coronavirus in good shape. There will be more austerity. There will be more cuts to social spending. The living conditions of the American people will undoubtedly get worse in the next few years. And we're already at a very low point today. Meanwhile, climate change effects will continue. It'll become obvious quite soon that climate change will drastically affect the world. There will be movements around that as well. There will be movements to decommodify society because ultimately we can't change climate change. We can't fix climate change without getting rid of a economic model and an economic system that tries to produce as many commodities as possible all the time. Maximum production means maximum damage. It's just the way it is. So there will be mass movements in years to come. And unlike historical situations, unlike Germany or Italy before World War II, both Germany and Italy had revolutionary movements in the early 20s. Both were defeated. Fascism came on the heels. In America, it's not going to wait for the heels. It's building today. It's building in recognition that these movements will come tomorrow. And it's going to be ready before the movements come, not after. And that, my friends, is a terrifying thought. I hope you all take it seriously. I'm living in Canada. I'm not in America. My country will be affected by this. My country will be brought down if America is brought down. That's the nature of a weaker neighbor with a lot of resources, and a lot of people, and a lot of materials to exploit. Take care of yourselves, America. Build resistance. Take this seriously. Fight defensive battles. If you're a revolutionary, if all you want to see is revolution and all you want to see is socialism, remember that revolutionary defense is a thing. Remember, it's important to be able to be a socialist without being in prison. Very important. You can't organize nearly as well from a prison cell. And revolutionary movements get put down by fascists. That's how it works. So good night on that pleasant thought.